Welcome back. We last left off with my colony in something of an interesting situation. Temperatures were rising, gas levels were rising, oxygen levels were falling, and my dupes weren't happy with any of it. By the end of that episode, I had largely gotten most of that under control with some basic atmospheric sanitation technology and electrolysis systems, but the latter of those are regrettably a temporary solution. I let the game run for a while and did some basic cleanup work around the base, which ironed out most of the little issues, but the big ones still remain. Electrolyzers produce heat. They consume water. And they consume an enormous amount of power, which is currently being produced exclusively via coal. Coal, in particular, is the concerning part, because by my math, I have only around 40 cycles of coal remaining at my current consumption rate before I have to mine out more space or find a different power supply. In light of these many potential colony killers looming on the horizon, I opt to handle none of them, and instead start playing with mushrooms. Those other problems are concerning and all, but they are only going to become critical in the next month or so, at the absolute earliest, and if I wait that long, I will be too busy starving to death to have to worry about them. Yeah, that calorie counter in the upper left, it has ever so slowly been creeping down, and this is entirely my fault. When I added my two dupes last episode, I neglected to budget for their caloric requirements. I have farms and stuff running still, and I was previously producing at an excess, so this isn't at risk of ending my colony or anything, but if I had noticed this any later, it could have gotten pretty hairy. My selected new food, dustcap, is a largely unremarkable fungus that consumes 4,000 grams of slime a day to produce roughly 350 calories worth of poor quality food per mushroom, which is actually an upgrade, sadly enough. It isn't a lot, but I have plenty of seeds, 8 dupes, and a metric ton of slime, and even if I didn't have those, slime is easy to bulk produce for a reason that starts with M and ends with orb, so they strike me as a solid option for investing in temporary food infrastructure. They also require a pure carbon dioxide atmosphere, which means I get to show off my new airlock design. It uses a whole, wait for it, 19.1 grams of water. This originally started as an experiment to see if I could design a water lock that didn't constantly cause the sopping wet debuff, which dupes get when they are whole body immersed in a fluid. I came up with some fun designs, but this one was the smallest by far and has the advantage of being resistant to gas pressure, theoretically. It doesn't seem to be the most stable of designs, though, and I can recall one instance where gray farting on it broke the seal, so I am worried that dupes exhaling CO2 might be a problem down the line. But I guess we'll see, won't we? Yeah, we will see in, not even 10 minutes. The best part about this is I am absolutely sure that it was Greythorn tooting that caused this, because I can still see the natural gas blob with a very suspiciously round number of exactly 100 grams floating right next to the damage. Congratulations, Grey. Your derriere has thus far been the single most difficult thing to engineer around in this episode. In light of the fact that my design is vulnerable to damage from passing breezes, I rebuild it with one that should hopefully be a tad more sturdy at the cost of dunking the dupes. Parts a lot still isn't allowed in, though. We don't like stinkers here. Anyway, with food back on the menu, it's time to take the plunge. All the way to the center of the Earth. With electrolyzers, I have a clean source of oxygen gas, so no longer will my atmosuits be reliant on the cooperation of my duplicant's bowel movements to prevent damage to the docks, so I see this as carte blanche to get back to the business of making a really big hole in the ground. For those of you who are wondering, the goal with this hole is multitudinous. First, I want all of the naturally spawned oil out of the world and into my factories. With a whole bunch of free time and some creative fluid logistics from the last episode, I should be able to sequester the entire map's oil supply in my black hole tank, which will then let me do, whatever I want with it. Currently, that's mostly just been using it as a really terrible coolant, give or take a bit of plastic production, but if I'm willing to engage in some really creative heat management strategies, it also offers me a route to large-scale polluted water and power production, should I get desperate. For now, I mostly just want it out of my way. The second is, of course, exploration. I can hardly be expected to maintain order on this silly little rock if I have no idea what I'm expected to organize, after all. For the most part, once you've seen one part of the oil biome, you've seen it all, though. There's a lot of oil, a lot of fossil, which no doubt is a priceless relic of the past that I will be grinding into steel additives at some point, and a couple of set-piece things that look vaguely useful with puzzles that could be bypassed in the traditional Minecraftian fashion of digging around the parts that require you to think. The most important find was an oil reservoir that lets me trade a kilogram of water for 3.3 kilograms of oil, which effectively means I can turn water into electricity at a really decent rate. I will definitely be making use of that at some point, but not immediately, because I have finally delved deep enough into the earth to unlock the crown jewel of my exploration efforts. Magma. Not to be confused with lava, because it's still underground and geologists are a little weird when it comes to their naming conventions, but you had better believe that the underground part of that sentence is not going to be the case for long, because this stuff is A, in my way, and B, an extremely spicy 1600 degrees centigrade, which means it is both in my way and going to be really tricky to move, seeing as my best pumps will turn into molten metal at that temperature. Hold up. And yes, pun absolutely intended. Before we go any further, I need to dig another big hole. Don't worry, I have reasons for doing this, I promise. Be right back. And we're back. Ran into some problems. I was successfully able to dig a really big hole despite the many considerations that I did not plan out ahead of time, and now have a second shaft all the way down to the magma layer. That part was fine. The less fine part was me not realizing that I dug too deep, which resulted in me exposing oil to a hot piece of abyssalite, and when that happened, thermodynamics happened, and when thermodynamics happened, 30,000 kilos of oil was compressed into a single tile because of gas pressure jankery, which cracked the abyssalite and cracked into a pocket of magma, which then blew the oil up instantly into sour gas. I managed to cap it off and drain the surrounding oil, but not before it came very, very close to breaching into the main magma layer, and as a result, I now have just really a disturbing amount of sour gas. The part that escaped before I capped it off is still at like a nice, convenient 6.6 kilos per tile air pressure, and the part that didn't is sitting comfortably at a nice 1,500 kilos, which is a hair over 750 times the normal safe operating pressure for gases. This is what you might describe as an oopsie whoopsie, because I kind of need access to the spot that the cap is covering, and to operate in that area, I now have to safely store and cool all of that gas. Now, amazingly, I do have the capacity to do that. I've been retrofitting one of my spare infinite gas tanks with a liquid cooling loop, and once that's finished, I can pump the gas in while simultaneously cooling it down enough to be safe to pump elsewhere once I'm ready for a final solution. So that particular remediation didn't go to plan and appears to have just made the problem worse. Did you know that pumps stop working when you get over their overheat temperature? I did. I apparently didn't know that 830 is bigger than 250 though, and they broke, and now there is an enormous pocket of several tens of thousands of kilos of 800 degree sour gas right where I was going to put my thermal vent, and I can't get rid of it. So, yeah. Not entirely sure how I'm going to be cleaning that up, because I can't build cooling infrastructure down there without it melting. At least I had the sense to put a door on it? Actually, no, that's a lie. I know exactly how to clean it up, and that is to double down. And do it right this time. I have faith, and apparently an excess of free time and a lack of standards on how it should be used, but that's me problem. In the meantime, since it is blatantly obvious that my coal supplies aren't going to last until this project is completed, I finally buck up and make the blatantly obvious solution to this problem, which is a single petroleum generator that will burn a drop or two of the several 100,000 kilos of oil I've been pumping out of the earth for the past 3 hours. Incidentally, at this time, I would like to also extend a formal apology to any and every one of my viewers who is familiar with how good designs are supposed to look in Oxygen Not Included. The entirety of this episode is going to be me slapping you repeatedly in the face with a white glove full of razor blades and incompetence, and it is not going to get any better. So you too will learn to love nuclear cable spaghetti. If it wasn't obvious, my power plan was to use the heat from the Earth's core to run a bunch of steam turbines for free, easy, with a major asterisk to get the end there, and almost infinite zero maintenance power production. This also does double duty as a way to slowly drain away the heat from the mantle, which will eventually condense it back down into rock, which I can then excavate and store accordingly. When I said I wanted complete map control, I was being very literal. The shaft I've almost completed here is supposed to be a vacuum-sealed steam shaft for deploying the water and collecting the steam, but there's a catch. The shaft has to be vacuum sealed in order to convey steam properly. On its own, that'd be fine, but there is a little something standing between me and a completed shaft, and that is, in my case, a deposit of 1300-degree sour gas grossing roughly 6 metric tons. I can't pump it because the pumps will melt. I can't drain it because that much gas would flood the entire map, and I can't cool it, both because I don't have the cooling capacity and because it is touching the mantle and would immediately reheat. So, what do? Non-machine objects made out of steel are about the only thing I have access to that can directly interact with temperatures anywhere close to that of magma. This means I'm restricted to wires, pipes, tiles, ladders, and doors, and from that limited supply of resources I have to concoct a solution from some combination. Which is surprisingly easy, and can be summarized in 2 words. Door spam. While their aphrodisiac properties are sadly underrealized in Oni, doors do at least still have the game-breaking property of being openable and closable, and that alone is sufficient. So, to continue the theme of compression-based exploits, I will ask you this. What happens when you close a door that has gas inside of it? Well, normally, the gas would just get shoved out of the way, which means that I can now make gas pumps that can move unlimited amounts of gas in physical space at the cost of not packetizing it, so that's busted. Cool. Not broken enough. Let's try the next obvious thing. What happens when the gas has nowhere to go? Well, it vanishes, doesn't it? I wonder if Goose is going to exploit the living daylights out of this. The answer is no, at least not in the way you're thinking. If you assume gas equalizes in pressure instantly, it is trivially obvious to see that the pump will be able to delete at most the pump's volume minus 2 divided by the pump's volume plus the room's volume percent of the gas in the space each cycling of the pump, which for me works out to about 12%. In reality, this number is made way worse due to the slow speed of gas spread, but it doesn't much matter because it will never be 100% and I need a perfect vacuum. The value here isn't so much in the pump's ability to delete large amounts of gas, as it is to delete any amount of gas perfectly when the space is 100% full of doors, which, when combined with some creative construction orders for tiles through the corners of walls, means I can reseal an excavated area remotely to turn it back into a vacuum without pumping it. Having this set up lets me send my only non-flatulent digger, Drake, on a very special mission. With a bit of permissions jankery, I get him set up so that he's wearing an Atmos suit outside the normal Atmos suit area, and then walk him into the vacuum-sealed steam chamber, where I have him dig up the soon-to-be voided-out steam tube and trap himself in it. After sandwiching him in, I then give him the wonderful task of digging out every single tile underneath him until he reaches my airlock. Dig or die, buddy. Dig or die. Once he gets to the bottom, I can then deconstruct and reconstruct the airlock doors to preserve the vacuum seal in the tube he just dug, while letting him escape back to freedom. Later along, I will have Dupes build the last of the insulated tile on the side Drake escaped from, and just like that, insulated steam tube with convenient shutoff valves if the steam ever gets too hot to handle. You're a trooper, Drake. Wish all my dupes were that willing to take the plunge. As part of my final cleanup on the design, I add some thermal sensors to the inputs of the turbines for optimization reasons. I gave up and read the wiki page on how turbines work because their in-game documentation was functionally non-existent, and in testing they seemed to behave really weirdly. Come to find out, the way turbines work is they can only absorb so much steam at a time, and the hotter the steam is, the more energy per unit mass of steam you will get. You can use more cooler steam to improve electrical output, but heat is really not going to be the issue here, so I went with what the wiki said was the most efficient design and called it a day. I enjoy doing my own experiments, but I have limits, and pointlessly repeating the work someone else has done is not one of them. All that to say, the system is ready. Just add water. I was being flippant when I said that just add water comment, but it turns out I do have to add a whole lot of water before the turbines can really do their thing. Steam is a gas like any other, and is therefore not immune to the whims of Oni's really slow gas movement rate. Conveniently, gas propagation speed is proportional to the pressure differential of the gas, which is a really fancy way of saying I am boiling a small ocean downstairs to increase both how much steam makes it to the top and how hot it is when it gets there. And I'm gonna need to figure out a way of automatically digging out the rock that forms when the magma cools. So, should have thought that one through a bit more. That will be a problem for another time, though. The real reason to get that going was so I could start draining the magma, and any power it produces is kind of irrelevant when compared to the energy I can get from petroleum products. So now that that little project is finished, it's time to focus back in on the rest of the base and deal with the egregious amount of heat that has been happening all over the place when I wasn't looking. Whoopsies. Go gadget conduction panels. You sound like you could help with this. Predicated on me, wiring them correctly, which seems unlikely. Also, Wesley just ate the entire colony's food supply on a stress-eating binge. I thought that binge eaters in RimWorld were bad enough to immediately justify a beatdown, but this is a whole new class of insanity in and of itself. Like, my dude, that was 40 meals of food. I very quickly figure out the solution to the whole can't make liquid airlocks in lava problem, and it's simple, really. Instead of using some boring fluid like water or oil, just make an airlock out of molten lead. To use the common tongue, those Atmos suits are kind of built different. One of the other fun things I can use my source of surprisingly not very infinite at all heat for is to quickly and conveniently purify large amounts of salt and polluted water. Boiling the water precipitates the salt and the dirt out, and the steam turns into pure, clean, germ-free water when processed by the steam turbines. Not, mind you, that this is terribly useful for me right now, seeing as I'm still producing a fair bit of polluted water by burning petroleum, but I need to get the geysers under control anyway, and this is an easy way of getting started on that. Plus, it gives me an excuse to further entangle the spaghetti, which, yeah, it's getting bad. So that whole project was fun. It was kind of a waste of time because I could have just put down another petroleum generator and called it a day, but anyway, that would have been boring, and I wanted to play with my hot rock soup. With my Dupes fed, my oxygen stable, and my power needs very solved for the foreseeable future, let's get back to what I wanted to work on in the first place. More industry, which means more digging, because all of this planet is going to become mine. A great deal of excavation later, and I'm pleased to report that I have successfully moved over 5 machines. Yep, that's all I wanted to do. Move 5 whole machines, like 50 meters to the right and a little bit down. Why yes, if asked to rearrange the furniture in my living room, I will, in fact, independently develop a space program with the express purpose of stapling your armchairs to the surface of Pluto. Why do you ask? In other news, I'm blinder than a bat in a bilge pump. You remember when I was looking around trying to find more geysers? Well, I missed one in plain sight. It outputs extremely hot hydrogen gas, and I already have plenty of hydrogen, so really all I'd be doing with it is ripping the heat out for steam turbines and burning the gas, which isn't really all that useful. But still, I literally only found this because the digging bill kept failing on the neutronium it was built on and did not notice it until I was literally excavating into it. Moving those machines, though, is useful, and it may or may not sound important, but what it lets me do is finally get rid of the terrible mess of wire that was my original power solution in favor of one 10 times the size and 30 times the complexity, but in a different location, so it's not a problem. Power logistics that doesn't make me want to stick a fork in an electrical outlet and lick the prongs every time I look at it is probably gonna be one of those things that I'm not ever gonna get to. But as long as it's not in my main base, I don't care. Now, everything is going smoothly, so what am I— oh, perfect, a crisis, just what I was looking for. So, background context. My heat deletion setup is terrible, and for once, it isn't my fault entirely. The immediate problem is that it's melting because I forgot to make the important bits out of steel and also somehow mistakenly left a radiant pipe in the steam chamber, which kind of makes it not work very well. Oops, that's bad, and is where the immediate problem is, but it's fixable. The part that isn't fixable is that I don't have good coolant, because thermodynamics is weird in this game. There are two numbers that are relevant when it comes to this sort of cooling design: specific heat capacity and thermal conductivity. Think of the two numbers as descriptors on a bottle. Thermal conductivity tells the game how fast heat can enter or leave the thing and is a bit like saying how big the mouth of the bottle is. Heat capacity is how much heat it can hold at any given time, also known as how big the bottle is. Obviously, when using a material as a coolant, you want those numbers to both be as high as possible. The problem that I'm running into is that oil has great thermal conductance, but lousy heat capacity. So it's a bit like I'm trying to bail out heat with a conveyor line made out of thimbles instead of barrels, and it introduces a lot of inefficiency. That inefficiency manifests as my oil bath slowly heating up as my aquatuner's primary coolant loop struggles to keep up, which means my coolant is less cool and can store less heat, which means the aquatuner struggles harder and the bath heats up more, and the vicious cycle continues. The only way of getting around this, short of adding more aquatuners, is to get a coolant with more heat capacity into the main coolant line, and preferably also the bath and secondary line. Water, polluted water, and salt water are all substantially better, but wouldn't be able to safely handle the heat extremes. Oil kind of sucks all around, and the only other easy-to-source medium that is liquid at room temperature is naphtha, which is barely an upgrade to oil. Gases aren't much use either. The best I have is hydrogen, which is only 50% better than oil on paper, but gases are so much less dense when pumped than fluids are that they simply aren't competitive. This leaves one option, which is supercoolant, which is locked behind the last tier of research in the base game, which involves space exploration. Oh, Pluto, I have some lovely new furniture for you. So, space. In addition to being the final frontier, space in Oni is not a terribly pleasant place for anyone. For one, it's not actually cold, despite the game doing its best to convince you otherwise, and usually it ends up being problematically warm. This sounds counterintuitive until you realize that there is no such thing as radiant cooling in Oni, and therefore the vacuum of space is actually a perfect insulator that happens to have a bunch of mildly cold things spawned into it at the start of the game. And the vacuum part can get really annoying when you're trying to launch rockets without melting their launch platforms. The second problem is any fluid or gas exposed to space immediately begins to dissipate. This behavior is tied to the properties of the background of the map, and isn't really an issue as long as you build with solid tiles and plate up the back of your base with a famously airtight material known as drywall. My floors will explode with pee if I compress the pee even a little bit, but a centimeter of rock dust and glue can somehow hold back the void of space. Sure, game. That brings us to the next fun thing about space: intermittent orbital bombardment. When left on their own, meteor impacts will generate enough regolith to offset the damage they cause to blocks, and certain kinds of meteor can leave behind small amounts of refined metals. All of this is great. The problem comes in when you want to build anything else up in space, because doing that requires you to build surface-to-air blast shot batteries or construct your roofs out of bunker tiles and bunker doors, which are made out of very expensive amounts of solid steel. Everything interesting you can do with space requires direct line of sight to it, though, so for this there is automation and the space scanner. The too long didn't read the wiki is that the space scanner tells you when meteors are coming in through the power of magic and 120 volts AC. More scanners equals more better signal, though you only really need 2 for the default map because reasons explained on the wiki that I'm not going to summarize because it involves math. That signal can be sent to your blast doors to tell them to shut their trap, and there is enough of a lead time on your detection with 2 scanners that the doors will always close before the meteors start hitting. The doors also eat power, though, so I, being me, decided to implement some basic automation to only power them when they have to open or close, and the big nerd summary of that is that the blob on the right of my scanner will detect a signal state change that indicates meteors are inbound or have stopped falling, and when it does, it will power the doors on before it tries to open or close them, saving me a bunch of power in the process. Anything that needs to be protected but also see the sky gets to live under the doors, and everyone is happy until the chunks of fallen meteor drop in when the doors open into my buildings, heat them above their overheat temperature, and break them into itty-bitty little pieces. Fun. Speaking of overheating, I discovered an unintended drawback of my magma eating project. And that is that my dupes are stupid. I've been steadily pumping in all of the excess salt water and polluted water that I have lying under the map under the abyssalite layer, resulting in a huge amount of hot, pressurized, and relatively thermally conductive steam. The more steam there is, the faster I can sequester heat into it, which wicks away heat from the magma, chills down the igneous rock formed by the magma, and lets me excavate it for more magma, all of this at a slowly increasing rate. Excavation, or sometimes just convenient magma drip patterns, form igneous rock items that maintain most of the heat of the material without taking up a tile of space, allowing me to wick more heat into the steam and creating more room for it to expand. All of that is great. The trouble is, one of these dingbats decided they needed to haul some of this 600-odd degree igneous rock and store it in my base. And then another one of the dingbats decided they needed to build something with this rock, resulting in an unexpected heat bomb right in the middle of the main industrial zone's access tunnel, causing multiple incapacitations and horrific burning on a good 2/3 of my colony before ambient temperature dropped to non-scalding temperatures, and forcing me to check every construction bill I do with igneous rock moving forwards. Thanks. Despite this minor case of crippling colony injury, there is good news to be had. Aside from that one mishap with igneous rock leakage earlier, my efforts to drain the depths have gone swimmingly, and I've pumped up and stored maybe 2/3 of the map's natural oil supply and excavated or steamified another third of the magma. The whole system is largely self-sustaining at this point, other than every once in a while requiring me to go down and dig out some more progress. The best news is that atmosuits contain the gas outputs of the dupes who are wearing them, so I don't even have to worry about carbon dioxide or natural gas contamination of the steam well. Though poor Gray is probably experiencing a truly heroic case of self-inflicted Dutch oven right about now. The telescopy stage of space research is also proceeding apace, despite the near-constant pounding my colony is taking from meteor strikes, to the point where I've started looking into things I can do to expose of extremely large amounts of regolith very quickly, simply because I have so much of it that anything even mildly useful would be an improvement over letting it sit there and do nothing. I'm certainly never going to be hurting for filtration material, at least. While we're waiting for Kasu to finish eyeballing random space rocks, let's start doing some general base cleanup. Ambient heat is an issue again, and while my earlier accident with lava rock definitely contributed to that in a big way, the temperature situation wasn't doing too hot before that. Or rather, it was doing it too hot, which was the problem in the first place. Despite making a couple major upgrades to my system to improve its heat conduction and swapping out the terrible oil coolant loops for slightly less bad polluted water ones, the system's stable point still only comes out to about 45 degrees centigrade, which is, zesty. And also not usually a temperature that you would select on your AC unit. This is entirely because it is trying to cool the steam turbines, which it does admirably, before it tries to cool the rest of the map with the steam turbine outflow, which is a bit like jumping in a sauna to cool off. There doesn't seem to be any more obvious, easy upgrades I can make to the existing system with my current tech, so I content myself with making a second heat deleter using what I learned from the first to provide some marginal improvements to its function. Mostly, this just means using more conduction panels and temp shift plates and simplifying the fluid temperature management system. The liquid pipe thermosensor seems to be a little bit unreliable and has a nasty habit of pausing when the coolant pipe is empty, and while it does restart if I click on it or inspect it, it would be much easier to use a shutoff valve instead of turning the aqua tuner off to prevent this from happening at all. So, awkward question for you. You remember how I was using liquid lead as an airlock for my magma chamber? Well, it looks like the surrounding material, melted. Yeah, that's bad. That's actually just really bad. It's a good thing I got most of the oil out of the biome before this happened, because that place is going to be pretty inaccessible for a little while. All of the steam you see sitting around down there came out of the vent at a nice healthy 500 degrees centigrade or so. The good news is that at least half the magma is gone, so it could have been a whole lot worse, but the bad news is a good third of the map is now actively hazardous to duplicant life. So, oops. Cleaning that up is gonna be fun, assuming I ever bother to, that is, but it, like so many other projects, will have to be something I tackle later. The Goose might have gotten a bit cooked this episode, but the really spicy thing is all of the YouTube support options down below. You should blow on them to cool them off with your finger. This is a stupid bit, and we're just gonna call it good here. Anyway, as always, thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed.